This podcast is not safe for work and will feature movie spoilers. It will feature scenes described of a graphic nature. It will contain language which most listeners may find offensive. Welcome to the podcast Under the Stairs. Hi everyone and welcome to the podcast Under the Stairs. I'm your host Duncan McLeish. Welcome to the show. This is a very small bonus tribute episode. The schedule that we will be undertaking for 2025 officially kicks off tomorrow with the first of 4 videos which will cover in blocks my top 20 horror movies of 2024. So that'll be starting officially tomorrow. Should have been officially starting on Friday, but the reason for this kind of tribute episode is the reason we've delayed off just a little bit. On the 15th of January 2025, David Lynch, maestro, avant-garde, artistic genius director, passed away at the age of 78. Now, there has been a bizarre flood of people talking about Lynch is bizarre in that when I usually talk about him, people's eyes usually roll. I think that's probably because as a artist, as a director, it's not even that he was polarising, he wasn't polarising. You either got it or were with it, or you weren't. And it was very seldom that you had that middle ground. I mean, there are movies that certainly straddle fandom, I think is the way I would describe it, where people could acclimate more to his directing style, his vision, his voice, etc. Than some of the more disparate ones. And certainly he's got a couple in there that are much more non-Lynchian, as a descriptive term, than other movies which are just straight out Lynch. But I would incessantly be excited about anything his name was attached to, any interview that was ever posted, anything at all. He practically got me through COVID with his daily updates. But I'd been a fan for a long time. I think the first Lynch movie I am conscious that I saw was probably Dune. But I remember so very little of it. I think the first movie that I knew I was watching a David Lynch movie would have been Blue Velvet, and that would have been 16, 17 years old, in or around that time. And I'll be honest, I had not a clue what was going on in that movie. It was kind of bewildering and at times very confusing. Now, that was the first movie I'd seen. I'd already very much been aware of that style beforehand, and that came via Twin Peaks. I watched Twin Peaks when it came out first time round because I am that fucking old, and I remember being hooked from like the first episode, just like in awe of this. Now we got it in the UK, I want to say delayed to what America got it, so I think back then, early 90s, things didn't get released on the same sort of schedule, so it wasn't like it is today where if like an episode of House of Dragon comes on, everyone in the world is watching it approximately the same time. Back then it was a case that things played in one territory for a while and then would eventually make their way over to another territory at a different time, or sometimes delayed a week, sometimes several weeks. If it was movies, it could be months. But I remember being totally fascinated with Twin Peaks, and I remember the ending of season 2 just flat out flooring me. I could not believe. And back then, no internet either, so we didn't. I heard it's cancelled, but I didn't know what that meant, if that made sense. I would have been, at that point, 11, 12 years old, and instantly grabbed onto the first thing I could television wise that would kind of fill that gap in my life, which was the X-Files, which started up pretty much in or around the same time that season 2 finished of Twin Peaks, and then several years later got into Blue Velvet, as my fandom for bands like Marilyn Manson and Nine Inch Nails, and my ever loving adoration for David Bowie continued. I found Lost Highway. I found Lost Highway much later after the fact, so Lost Highway was about 2000, 2001 for me, and it was in close proximity to the release of Mulholland Drive, which I saw at the cinema and was just blown away by how incredible it was. And over time started to explore more of his work, and in time you watch things like Eraserhead, and you finally get around to maturing yourself up to watch something like The Elephant Man. Wild at Heart was much later on, even though it's got Nick Cage and I love Nick Cage. It was much later on in my kind of viewing experience. As was Fire Walk With Me. Fire Walk With Me was always I don't know if I want to watch that. Its reputation precedes it as being something maybe not worthy of my time. And what's been really interesting in the time that I've been doing podcasting, so like by 2013 when Podcast Under the Stairs starts up, I revisited Fire Walk With Me and love it. Right, I think it's absolutely amazing. And the internet's still kind of not quite there with it, but nowadays I see more people talking about how amazing it is, and I think that speaks to David Lynch overall as a director. I think when his films do connect with you, like the best pieces of art, you go and see an opera and it doesn't, grab or emote you in any way because of the mood you're in, and 5 years later you could be going through a completely transformative point in your life, and when you watch it, it connects with you in such a way that it's there with you forever. Or you see a painting and you look at it and you just see what's on the flat surface superficially, but you may see it years later, and something about the experience you're having that day or that year or whatever it is makes you appreciate it in a deeper fashion than you did before. And that's a connection that you grab to. It's that kind of almost primal emotive sort of hook that just will tether you to that. It's like when you break up and you hear a song, and then whenever you hear that song it reminds you of the breakup, even though you may have heard that song a million times before and you never had any emotional connection with it in any way, shape or form. These things are important, and true art should be that way. True art should have an impact, whether positive or negative, whether happy or sad, whether angry or joyous. You should have some sort of emotional connection, and those that fall kind of flat or cold to an extent are, no artist wants that. No artist wants you to be indifferent to what they do. They want you to have a response even if you hate it. And I think Lynch was kind of, as a filmmaker, incredibly good at doing that. He's maybe one of the last crop of directors who could legitimately get through their entire career without necessarily explaining what it is they did, they meant, they do, or they want. And I find that inherently fascinating, the idea that the director himself, whether he knows or not, and I've read articles where people are like, Mulholland Drive is just, it's pieced together lots of different ideas and it doesn't really make sense, and David Lynch doesn't know what it means, and we're just going to pretend it does make sense because he's made some movies before that were successful. And I kind of get that to an extent, why you might feel skeptically that might be the case, but I also feel that he believes so much in his legacy as a filmmaker that I just don't think he would do that, and it wouldn't have the impact that it did. I think when you look at cinema as a kind of linear and almost flat surface medium, then you get comfortable with a beginning, a middle and an end. Ultimately that's how we tell stories, so once upon a time, it's how you start off, something happens in the middle, and the end is the end. And that linear journey between that start point and the end point is essentially what I would say a huge amount of audiences, and I'll be honest, I think everyone craves it for a sense of finality. I think when you break that down, some people don't like stories told in a non-narrative structure or non-linear structure as well. And I think, personally, my brain has always opted for something that challenges me a little bit more, even if the reward at the end of that challenge is something utterly futile. The kind of mental gymnastics I've had to go through to get there is very, very important. And I think like the best of Lynch is that. It's the feeling unsettled and not sure why you're unsettled. It's the moment of confusion when you realise that what you thought you'd latched onto wasn't actually all that important overall. It's the trying to pick out the symbolism in a way which you will never get an answer to. Even when he was alive, you would never get an answer to. A hugely important director to me. I've spoken about him ad nauseum. I don't think without the successfulness of David Lynch as a director and his unique voice, studios like A24 don't exist. I genuinely feel that way. I think when Twin Peaks The Return came out, and myself and Bo Ransdell, the podcaster, both he and myself had, or have, although I haven't done much on it, a kind of side podcast called Duncan and Bo Come Correct, where we would spend a huge amount of time going through like movies, TV shows and all the rest, and we did the entire Twin Peaks series 1, series 2, Fire Walk With Me, the two Mark Frost books about the kind of lost worlds and symbolism behind Twin Peaks, Jennifer Lynch, his daughter's book, which had the kind of Laura Palmer diaries. We did the Twin Peaks The Return, the entire series in review, and it was only when I got to like the end of watching The Return that I realised how blessed we were to be in a position where the guy had essentially set a template for how to change television back in the early 90s, and all the TV shows that kind of followed suit and just like broke the narrative mold. But Twin Peaks The Return, I think, did the same again, and as a result, I think we're getting some really interesting TV that is a bit more avant-garde and it's a bit more artistic and it's a bit more off the wall. You could argue, and I would say you're right, that in a world where Twin Peaks The Return doesn't exist, a TV show like Severance doesn't exist, and that's got a wild, crazy following now, and it's about to return with its second season. So I think those things kind of lock in together. That bizarre, surreal world of David Lynch has become not only a way to describe things in the term Lynchian, but actually a way that people look at the world. It became a kind of a popular meme. Like during COVID, the amount of people that had as either kind of PNG kind of logos over their pictures on social media that said directed by David Lynch, or just out and out directed by David Lynch. I mean, the show art for this episode will say directed by David Lynch, because I kind of feel like it was a way that people could try and wrap their head around how unwrappable it is to get their head around how things operate in the world. Like that kind of must be from the mind of a man who creates things that is, you know, designed to break your brain. As a filmmaker, I think if I had a Mount Rushmore, David Lynch would be on it. You know, if I could make one for directors, I think he's that good. I personally don't think he ever made a bad movie. Even though I have favourites, and so I'm not going to say every movie scores incredibly high with me. Some maybe less than others. But even then, I think they're infinitely fascinating to talk about. I know that in the background, myself and Doug Tilley, who usually does the director conversations with myself, are putting together a massive look at the work of David Lynch, which I'm not going to put a timeline on, but it's going to cover everything. It's going to cover all his TV, all his short works, books, music. We're going to cover his albums. commercials, like music videos, the works. We're doing the entire thing, all Twin Peaks again. I'm going to go back through it again, and again, and again. But we're going to do the whole thing. And whilst in previous times that might feel like a taxing opportunity, I kind of very excited to do it. I think his loss, even though I kind of had it in my head that when he made the return, that was probably the last we were going to see of him, even though he did the monkey crime short on Netflix. I kind of had the feeling that was probably it. And when you take into account that Twin Peaks Returned is maybe the most David Lynch thing that exists, and it's also 18 hours of him directing, which is almost the entirety of the length of all his movies put together. He did on top, and he managed to get that put out by a TV station. It's just kind of nuts to think of. I think the world is a slightly less interesting place without a minute, but I think his body of work stands the test of time. I genuinely think that there are a ton of directors that we feel are very important right now that will not have the same impact culturally, artistically, and even weirdly commercially that David Lynch will have even 20 years from now. It's bizarre to think of, and even stranger looking at the world of social media, was just kind of opened up with, like, so many people have a David Lynch experience, a movie they saw in the cinema that broke their brain, a movie they can never go back to, something that hit them at the right time, an experience, whether it be through Twin Peaks or Inland Empire or whatever it is. Those experiences that kind of come out upon his death, and for a guy who seldom felt the need to explain anything, I think he'd be, I don't know if he'd be touched, but I don't know if he knew how important he was as a director, and I think that's a good thing. I think when you start to get high on your own supply, so to speak, that's where it becomes less important and less special. And I don't think he ever succumbed to that. I don't think he was ever fully oblivious to it, but I don't think he understood. And that probably kept him true to what it is that he did, which was never really part of the mainstream, but apparently affected the mainstream. The outpouring from directors, actors across the board, of people that are just kind of floored by his passing, but also the stuff that he did is kind of incredible, and something that is going to be hard to replicate. I know we look at movies by directors like Ari Aster and we can see connective tissue there for sure, but I kind of feel like the pathfinder of Lynch being Lynch has allowed directors to be, and studios to be, a bit more confident about putting money behind it as well. So yeah, there was no real purpose to this. When I found out on Thursday, I kind of knew I wanted to do something. It's taken me a couple of days to get my head around what it is I wanted to do, and even then, when I sat down here, this isn't actually what I wanted to do. It's rather more kind of stream of consciousness, kind of, I don't know what I wanted to get out of doing this. I don't know if there needs to be a point, or if it's actually more worthwhile reminiscing about things that are important to us and the impacts they have on our lives when those people move on. And that in itself, I think, is probably the reason, the justification. I don't know. Very, very strange. My brain's kind of wandering off, but yeah, I want to do something to mark this for prosperity. And yeah, I'd be curious, what's your David Lynch movie? What's the one that you fell in love with, had the most visceral reaction? And that can be did not like it, hated it, why did I waste my time, will never watch anything else by this guy again. But I'd be curious to know what is that connected or disconnected with you in the way it did. So yeah, that's the purpose of this video, is let's have a dialogue. As always, this is on YouTube, it's on Spotify, it's on Anchor in video format, so please like and subscribe. If you're checking this out in the audio version, which is pretty much every other podcatcher, thank you very much for checking this out. Podcast Under Stairs does officially return for its 2025 run of shows tomorrow, where we'll be doing 20 through 16 in my top 20 horror movies of 2024. So wherever you are, whatever the time zone is, and whatever you're up to in this great, big, strange Lynchian world of ours, please take care of yourselves out there. The Stunken McLeish broadcasting live from under the stairs, and I am signing off.